Hey everyone, big meeting coming up. Need to talk economics. Bet you want to get a handle on GDP.
Yeah, makes sense.
It can feel a little intimidating.
Sure, definitely.
No worries, we've got you.
Absolutely.
Today, we're going to break it all down, making sure you walk into that meeting confident and ready to impress.
It's interesting how GDP has become like the go-to measure for economic health globally. Everyone uses it,
hmm
policymakers, investors, businesses. Understanding it can give you a real edge in so many situations.
Okay, so first things first, what exactly is GDP?
Well, the textbook definition of GDP, or gross domestic product, is the total value of all the final goods and services
Oh.
produced within a country's borders over a specific period, usually a year.
Hmm. Final goods and services. What does that actually mean?
Think of it this way. It's about what's actually bought and sold.
Yeah.
So when you buy a loaf of bread from a bakery, that purchase contributes to GDP. But if you bake that same loaf at home, it doesn't count. It's all about those market transactions. Okay, that makes sense. But hold on. Calculating that for an entire country seems like a massive undertaking. How do they even begin to track all of that?
You're right.
Right.
It's a huge amount of data, but there's a well-established system in place, the system of national accounts,
Okay.
that ensures accuracy and comparability across countries.
So we can trust that these numbers are pretty reliable. That's reassuring. Okay, so if we can trust the numbers, how do they actually measure this economic activity? Do they literally add up the price of every cup of coffee, every car, every house sold?
Not quite. It's a bit more sophisticated than that name. Economists look at it from different angles. For example, one approach is to add up all the spending on final goods and services,
Hmm.
while another looks at the income earned in the production process. It's like examining the same economic puzzle from different perspectives.
Interesting. It sounds like they've got it pretty well figured out, but there's always something that trips me up. The whole real versus nominal GDP thing.
Ah, yes. That's a crucial distinction. Nominal GDP can be misleading because it doesn't take inflation into account. Imagine a country produces the same amount of goods this year as last year, but prices have doubled. Nominal GDP would show significant growth.
Right. Yeah, it would look like the economy is booming, but it's just the prices that have gone up.
Exactly. That's why we use real GDP. It strips away the impact of inflation, giving us a clearer picture of whether actual production has increased or decreased.
I get it now. So we want to look at real GDP to get a more accurate picture of what's happening. But how does GDP growth or lack of it translate to things we experience in everyday life?
Well, GDP growth is often used as a general indicator of a country's economic health. Strong GDP growth usually means businesses are thriving. They're hiring more workers. People have more money to spend. It's a positive cycle.
Makes sense. And when GDP shrinks,
Can
that's when
you-
we see recessions, job losses, people tightening their belts.
Right. But here's where it gets interesting. GDP growth, while important, doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't capture everything that contributes to a society's well-being.
I see your point. It seems like focusing solely on GDP could lead to overlooking other important factors. Like what? What's missing from the picture?
Well, for starters, GDP doesn't really address how wealth is distributed. A country could have a high GDP, but a huge chunk of the population might not be seeing any of the benefits.
Precisely, GDP growth alone doesn't tell us anything about income inequality. It's entirely possible for the rich to get richer while the poor struggle ceiling, even when GDP is going up.
So a rising tide doesn't necessarily lift all boats.
That's one way to put it. And that brings us to another key point. GDP doesn't account for the environmental impact of economic activity.
Right. A country could be achieving high GDP growth in a way that's really damaging to the environment, burning through resources, polluting the air and water. None of that's reflected in GDP.
Exactly. In fact, some argue that pursuing endless GDP growth can actually be detrimental to the environment and ultimately harm our well-being.
So if GDP isn't the be-all and end-all, what other measures should we be looking at to get a more complete picture of a country's well-being? There are a number of alternative measures that try to capture a broader range of factors. For example, the UN's Human Development Index takes into account things like life expectancy, education levels, and standard of living, in addition to income.
I've also heard of the Genuine Progress Indicator, which tries to factor in things like the value of unpaid work, like childcare or volunteer work, as well as the costs of things like pollution and crime.
These alternative measures can provide a more nuanced view of how a society is doing. They acknowledge that true progress goes beyond just economic output.
It sounds like we need to be looking at multiple indicators, not just relying on GDP as the sole measure of success.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding the strengths and limitations of different metrics. GDP can tell us a lot about the overall size and activity of an economy, but it doesn't capture everything that's important for a society's well-being.
Thinking about this meeting I have coming up, how can I use this knowledge of GDP to sound really informed?
Well, remember, you're prepping for a meeting about Pakistan's economy, right? You can bring up that while Pakistan's GDP has been growing recently, it's important to consider other factors that might not be reflected in that growth.
Okay, so I could mention things like income inequality, environmental impact, and the fact that there are alternative measures that give a more holistic view of a country's well-being.
Exactly. You can even drop in some specifics about Pakistan's recent economic performance. For instance, you could mention that they've been recovering from a balance of payments crisis.
Oh, right. I remember reading in the Focus Economics source that Pakistan's GDP has been growing for 5 consecutive quarters, which is a sign of recovery.
Yes, and they also pointed out some potential challenges that Pakistan is facing.
They mentioned slower export growth and weaker business confidence. Those are definitely things to keep in mind.
They also noted that large manufacturers in Pakistan are dealing with high energy and borrowing costs, which could impact their output.
Right. So even though Pakistan's GDP is growing, there are some headwinds that could slow down their progress. This is great. I'm feeling much more prepared for this meeting now. Thanks for all these insights.
You're doing great.
Yeah.
Remember, the key is to use this knowledge to think critically about economic data and to ask the right questions.
It seems like being able to confidently talk about GDP can give you a real advantage in so many situations. It's not just about memorizing definitions, it's about understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. By understanding concepts like GDP, we can become more informed citizens and make more thoughtful decisions about the future we want to create.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've defined GDP, talked about how it's calculated, and discussed its strengths and weaknesses as an indicator. We even dug into some specifics about Pakistan's economic outlook.
And we've emphasized the importance of considering alternative measures of well-being that go beyond purely economic output. It's all about looking at the bigger picture.
I feel like this deep dive has given me a whole new perspective on economics. I used to find it dry and intimidating, but now I see it as this fascinating lens through which we can understand the world around us. It really feels like we're shifting from like a black and white image to a full color picture.
Exactly. And as we continue to gather data and develop new indicators, we're gaining a more nuanced and holistic understanding of what it means to live a good life, both individually and as a society.
Thinking back to my meeting prep, what's a strong takeaway I could leave people with?
You can emphasize that while GDP is a useful starting point for assessing economic performance, it shouldn't be the only measure we consider. To truly understand a country's well-being, we need to look beyond just economic output and consider factors like income distribution, environmental sustainability, and overall quality of life.
It's like we're saying, hey, there's more to life than just money.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that true progress involves creating societies that are prosperous, equitable, and sustainable.
I feel much more equipped to engage in these kinds of discussions now. It's not just about spouting off statistics. It's about understanding what those numbers really mean and what they don't tell us.
Exactly. It's about using data to inform our decisions and to create a better future.
Well, on that note, any final thoughts for listeners out there who are on their own journey of economic discovery?
I would encourage them to stay curious, question assumptions, and never stop seeking a deeper understanding of the forces that shape our world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. If GDP isn't a perfect measure of well-being, what should we be paying attention to? What other indicators, both on a national and global scale, can help us create a world where everyone thrives? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into GDP.